What's going on, everyone? It's Mr. West. I hope you're all well. So welcome back to another ultimate video test, and this time we're looking at the Huawei P30 Pro in low light conditions. Now, as with all ultimate video tests, I'll leave all of the main camera specifications down in the description, and I'll just run through some of the high level features throughout the video to save you some time. So starting with the front facing camera, and this is a 32 megapixel fixed focus camera. It has what Huawei calls AI HDR, which is currently switched on. It has electronic image stabilization, automatic exposure control and object tracking, and both the front and rear cameras benefit from stereo sound recording via a microphone at either end of the handset. Now, a quick disclaimer: most of the smartphones I've tested in the last 12 months don't do an absolutely amazing job in low light due to their smaller sensors, and the electronic image stabilization also can tend to make things a little bit blurry when you're walking. So if I kind of stand still, if I just shake the handset, you can see this bungalow behind me is kind of going all fuzzy. That is just a characteristic of the electronic image stabilization, but it's worth showing you how the phone copes in this kind of situation, because you may find yourself in this scenario at one point and may want to find out how the phone handles this kind of lighting conditions. Let's check out exposure then with things like street lighting. So we can see we kind of get this kind of flower effect from these street lights. You can see there. Now, some phones have like a starburst effect. This has a sort of flowery effect as you move to the center of the light, but it handles that quite well. It's still keeping the exposure on me quite nicely, but blowing out the lights due to the smaller sensor. You get this little light here as well, which is characteristic of practically every smartphone that I've tried. So there's kind of a varying mix of street lighting here. These street lights just behind me are still the old style lights, which are kind of orange rather than LED white, which some of them are. So it's a good test of how the phone handles different lighting conditions. Now, if I look straight behind me into the schoolyard there, so we can just about make out the school. It's very, very dark in that area, but the details are a little bit mushy. Now, while here, let's check out the electronic image stabilization from the front facing camera with a bit of speed. And I can see there, just as I was running, the grass kind of just tends to turn to a mush behind me. But again, this is expected. I'm not expecting miracles. I just want to give you an indication of how the phone handles low light video. So that's the front facing camera. We'll switch to the rear camera array now and show you what that's all about in low light. Okay, so moving to the rear camera now. So there are 4 sensors overall on the back of the Huawei P30 Pro. So the first is a 40 megapixel autofocus camera. It can record video at up to 4K 30 frames per second. And it is a standard wide angle lens. There is also a 20 megapixel ultra wide angle camera. Now you can see there's a definite difference in the exposure level as we switch to the wide angle camera. Ultra wide, I should say. And then we've got what Huawei calls an 8 megapixel Periscope camera. Now, this allows you to do things like this, which is 5 times zoom, and also 10 times zoom, and all the way up to 15 times zoom, which is digital, which doesn't look that good in low light. Very, very fuzzy. So the 10 times is hybrid, and 5 times zoom is optical. So just go back to the wide angle. Now, the rear camera also benefits from electronic image stabilization. There is also a 4th sensor, which is what Huawei calls a time of flight sensor, and that measures how light hits objects and also distance and depth of field in real time to help improve the overall image. Now, that only works in photo mode rather than in video, so it just employs just the main sensor and the wide angle camera, and the periscope sensor works in conjunction with the main camera to combine one image. Now, in low light, that does suffer a bit. Now the Huawei P30 Pro uses what Huawei calls a new RYYB sensor rather than a RGB sensor. Now you can see it is gathering quite a lot of light from the sky in the distance there. That is a lot brighter than what I am seeing. And to give you an idea, this silhouette in the distance, I cannot see that with a naked eye at all. I can just about see the lighting in the house just here. So over here we've got some decent lighting. Let's try out the autofocus. As we can see, even in low light, it's nice and smooth. There is a lot of grain in the image, which is as expected, but the autofocus module is nice and smooth even in low light. It behaves exactly the same as in daylight situations. A tiny little bit slower to focus on the background, but overall I'm impressed with how it handles the autofocus in lower light situations, which is cool. So we're currently recording at 1080p at 30 frames per second. So switch up to the wide angle lens and you can see the exposure drops completely and we lose that mega exposure we were getting from the main lens. So this is basically what I can see now with the naked eye rather than what the main RYYB sensor sees with that crazy exposure. So back to wide angle. Now while we're here, we'll see how the different lenses handle exposure with things like street lighting. So this is with the wide angle lens. You can see we get kind of a starburst effect on the street lighting there and some kind of cool lens flare into the camera. If we switch to the main wide angle lens, still starbursty, but you get that kind of flower effect we were seeing from the front facing camera as well. Let's see how the Periscope camera handles that. So this is 5 times zoom now. So this is optical. We can kind of see things are getting a bit strange. And this is now 10 times hybrid. And all the way up to 15 times. You can kind of make out the shape of the light there, but it's not ideal conditions. So we'll go all the way back to the wide angle camera. So let's check out electronic image stabilization first with the wide angle camera. So that's wide. And this is the standard lens. And the 5 times Periscope does have electronic image stabilization, but obviously micro movements with footsteps do upset the image just a little bit. Now at 10 times, still get stabilization, but it's much more exaggerated every step that I take. Alright, so briefly looking at 1080p at 60 FPS, so slightly smoother movement. Now as with my daylight video test, you can see just moving the camera around, the P30 Pro does have some slight micro stuttering in the image when moving laterally, left and right. Doesn't really affect it when moving forward. Faster motion moving forward does have some drop frames, but it's just something which is a trait of the Kirin 980 chip. I'm sure that these things will improve with future revisions. Now in 1080p 60, you still get that crazy exposure from that main lens. When moving to the wide angle camera at 60 frames per second, you get that expected complete drop in exposure. So double the frames means half the exposure. You can pretty much not see anything into the distance there, whereas if I just switch to the main lens, just allow that to focus for a moment, you can see it does drag in quite a lot of light, but it's having some trouble locking focus. So you can still use the Periscope camera, but this is now just digital zoom and not optical, so do bear that in mind if you're looking to record at 60 FPS, as the Periscope camera doesn't have that cool clarity that it has in 30 FPS modes. So you still get electronic image stabilization at 60 FPS. Some phones do just go back to optical stabilization, but not this. So let's just try out the stabilization at 60 FPS. And you can see it keeps things nice and smooth with a bit of speed at the same time, which is cool. Now, like the front-facing camera, you can employ some different scene modes with the rear camera, but in my opinion, they're not really worth it. They don't look that brilliant. So that is 60 FPS at 1080p from the main camera, and we'll just show you wide angle. So yeah, that is pretty much unusable. Even if I was to increase the exposure on the camera, it's still not that brilliant. So that's not something you would really use in this kind of situation. Better off using that main sensor to get in as much light as possible. Okay, so this is 4K at 30 frames per second. Again, from the standard lens with that crazy exposure from its new RYYB sensor. And the grass is a little bit day glow green. But as with most smartphones I've used, this is pretty much the same scene as I see every single time. So at 30 frames per second, the wide angle camera, you still got that slightly dimmer look to the footage, but this is much more usable than at 60 frames per second. And also you get the Periscope zoom as well, which has got nice sharp focus. And the electronic image stabilization helps to keep things nice and smooth. So you do have to kind of give it just a short second or so just to allow it to focus itself and snap everything into focus. And the 10 times zoom, the same as well. So it does suffer in low light. It's not quite as sharp, it's quite grainy. Most phones can't do this and keep this level of clarity, so the P30 Pro is very unique in this segment in the fact that it can do this at all, which is great. So I'm just going to check out the main sensor in this much darker part of this car park here. Now this is my vision. I can't see anything, so what you see here in front of you, I cannot see that with the naked eye. It is completely dark. Even if I stand here for a minute or so just to allow my eyes to adjust, I cannot see that. So it's great that the phone is dragging in all of that light. It's not perfect by any means, but it is doing a good job of adjusting its exposure just to get in as much into the scene as it can, which is impressive. Just to give you an idea, go back to the wide angle camera and it just falls completely flat. That is what I can see with the naked eye. So let's see how the Periscope camera copes in this lower light situation. Now in the daylight I would be able to see this small plaque above the door of the chapel. But in low light, the 5x camera does struggle to kind of snap into focus like it does in daylight. The 10x hybrid does do a little bit better, but it's very, very dark. And the colour balance is completely out as well. Kind of goes all grey and murky rather than... That is kind of what I'm seeing with the naked eye. As you can see there, you can see the difference in the colour between the lenses. And there's the wide angle. So that is the Huawei P30 Pro Ultimate Video Test from both the front and rear cameras in all resolutions up to 4K at 30 frames per second. I will say there's some mixed results in low light, especially from the Periscope zoom camera. As expected, it doesn't really perform as well as it does in daylight. It does struggle in certain light situations to focus on certain objects, as you saw in the video there. But that's the whole point of these video tests, is to show you and give you an indication of how these phones perform in this kind of scenario, to help you make a choice of whether this is the phone for you if you are going to be filming outside at night. So if you've got any questions, then please leave those down in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing so you don't miss more videos coming on the channel, including more ultimate video tests coming very, very soon. But for now, this has been my ultimate video test in low light for the Huawei P30 Pro. My name's Mr. West, and I'll catch you guys later.